So I'm Roma, and I'm a UX lead on Chrome. So you've already heard today about all the different ways that we're tackling the web app experience from so many different fronts. And you've heard about the performance improvements, how we're bringing capabilities to web apps that native apps already have, and balancing the friction of permissions with still keeping users safe. So I'm here to talk today a little bit about the user experience front in general. We've made some pretty significant steps this year that make it easier to design intuitive and beautiful user experiences across native and web platforms. And my hope is that you guys leave this talk with a general understanding of the philosophy behind material design, some practical tips on how to get started even if you don't have a designer on your team. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the Chrome UX changes that we've made in Android L that we hope moves the mobile web experience forward. So before I dig into the philosophy of material design, let's take a look at the material design reel so you can get a visual design sense of what it's about. The reason I want to get into the philosophy of material design instead of just jumping straight into the spec and giving you practical tips is that I think it's really important to understand what this design framework is trying to achieve. The spec is online. You guys could just go there right now and look at it. And it makes it easy for people to build well-designed apps. And that's really important. But what I'm hoping is that by understanding the philosophy behind this design framework, you guys can help us evolve it further. A spec is never going to be able to cover all the complexities of any app out there. And we need you guys to really kind of push on it and use it in novel ways to help us evolve it. It's a community effort. So getting into the philosophy, material design is based in real-life tactile experiences. The name material suggests this, but it was really heavily inspired by studies of paper and ink, but it's more open and imaginative with behavior because there's code behind it. So paper lends itself really well to squares, simple shapes like squares and circles, but unlike real paper, this material can split, heal, rearrange itself, and move itself about when it needs to. And while we want users to feel like they can interact with it in a realistic way, like real paper, things should always feel intuitive. So let's take an example of what it means to be material. Material design has attributes that we're innately familiar with in real life. So there's surfaces, edges, light, dimensionality, and movement. All of these things give us visual cues about how these objects relate to each other and what the affordances are in a design. Material design is bold, graphic, and intentional. It's based on the foundational elements of print design and graphic design. Typography and imagery, colors, grids, scale, and space all guide the visual design. And when used appropriately, these elements combined will really make up an aesthetically pleasing UI and a more immersive experience. But beyond the surface look and feel, when these elements are used best, they should really also have function. They should help convey the meaning of elements, the hierarchy of the UI, and where users should be focusing their attention. So let's take a look at Gmail before and after having applied these elements of design, how it affects it. There's a lot more white space, it's more readable, and with the use of color and this floating action button, you see where the user is supposed to focus their attention to. So these elements should also provide consistency and a sense of familiarity across platforms and devices. In material design, you've probably noticed that there's a lot more motion and animation. And it's not just there for the sake of it. Motion is meant to provide meaning. So motion and animation are really meant to reinforce the idea that the user is initiating change. The user is initiating action, and they're in control. So motion cascades from touch points. Changes in the interface are meant to provide visual feedback and feel really directly connected to what the user has just done. Motion also allows us to make the experience more immersive and natural. It's no longer this, jump from screen A to screen B, but a really fluid and deliberate transition between states. Material design also aims to create a unified experience across native and web platforms and all the different device sizes that are out there. Across devices, the user is meant to be seeing the same view of the same design. And obviously, based on the screen size, the interaction and the input method that is appropriate for whatever that device is, things should change, but the colors, iconography, and hierarchy should all remain somewhat constant. All right, so those are kind of the basics of the philosophy behind material design. Now I kind of want to shift gears into how you can actually apply these principles. So the entire material design spec is up on google.com/design/spec. If you have the luxury of a dedicated designer on your team, this is the spec that they should be going off of. But if you don't, that's why we're here right now. So first of all, you probably want to use Polymer since it's, you can get it nearly for free, and it's specifically for building material design for web apps across desktop and mobile. And their website has everything you need to get started, including some really great demo apps that show you the interactive elements of material design. So Polymer is a tool, and you're actually going to be hearing more about it later. But I'd like to dive into a practical, basic checklist of how to apply material design to your apps. And the particular things that I'm going to talk about will help you make kind of critical design decisions, even if you don't have a designer on your team, and hopefully give you the biggest bang for your buck. So material design has recommended spacing and sizing guidelines, all of which are detailed in the online spec. Following these can really just help the readability and usability of your app. So components are on an 8 device-independent pixel square grid. Type is on a 4 DP square grid. And the size of structural elements are based on these things called increments. And increments are based on the standard app art height, which is 56 dips on mobile and 64 dips on larger screens. So for example, we have 3 different apps here, and they all have different needs for different app bar heights or different view heights for whatever reason. And all of these things are in increments of 2, 3, or nx the size of the standard app bar height, which is shown in the orange one on the right. There are a number of layout templates available to you on the online spec for mobile, tablet, and desktop. And they give you an idea of how keylines and spacing can work across screen sizes, window sizes, different structures, and different elements. And if you're building an app designed for touch input, you should really make your touch targets 48 by 48 in DP, whether the icons or elements within that 48 by 48 take up that full space or not. So Polymer has a lot of components that you get for free. You should take advantage of those. This includes icon sets, widgets, elements, and transitions, all based on material design. I'm going to take a second to call out one of the specific components that's pretty recognizable. in material design, and that is the floating action button, or fab, or paper fab. This thing is supposed to be the main and iconic action of your app. It's not supposed to be any arbitrary action, but something that a user can really look at in one glance and understand what is your app about. So for example, we have this media app here, and a play pause button really gets the essence of what this app is about. In the Maps app, you have a driving directions button with a car. You really get a sense of, like, this is what this app is about. And you should only ever have one of these components on the screen at one time, and you probably don't need these floating action buttons on all of your screens within your app. Colors. So material design has a lot of color palettes that you should take advantage of. I do want to stress, since it's come up before, that the material design color palette does not equal the Google design color palette. This thing has plenty of range to fit any app's branding and style needs. So it's easy to start with the primary color of your app. This is usually going to be the brand color of your app. So if the brand of your app is red, let's say, this should probably be red instead of indigo. And then we have this notion of accent colors. So accent colors really should be bright, not dull or dark, and they're really used for buttons, UI elements, and components that you want the users to focus and guide their attention to. The material design spec recommends a stack of Roboto, then Noto, then sans serif, that's the font stack, at least for body size text. But we do acknowledge that fonts are often inseparable from branding. So if you have a specific font for your brand that really you want to use everywhere, we recommend using it for display size text, not for body size text per se. But regardless of the fonts that you use, you really should use the sizing and spacing and weight and style guidelines that they have in the spec. They've made it really easy for you guys to just take that, and there's tons of typography nerds that have worked on this stuff. All right, depth. Dimensionality and shadows and depth are very important in material design. So it helps to think of your UI as existing in Z space, not just X and Y. So depth shouldn't just be ornamental. Depth should be giving users hints of how sections relate to each other and move in ways that seem plausible. Once you understand the relationship of how sections in your UI relate to each other, then you can start adding shadows and dimensionality to things. So for example, on the left, you see if there is a shadow there that makes those two sections look somewhat separate from each other or somewhat of a gap, it's natural for the user to assume that if I swipe one of those things away, that the other one may remain and moves independently of the other. But the one on the right, the seam between them is like a very light line. They still feel like they're coplanar on the same section, and you would imagine that if I swiped one of them in one direction, both of those things are going to go in the same. The Z position is also meant to be a reflection of your content hierarchy, and you're probably going to use it with content that you typically want the user to be focusing on, such as dialog boxes or floating action buttons that we were talking about earlier. And this Z depth hierarchy isn't necessarily a constant or fixed thing. For example, when a user selects a date from calendar and it expands and moves forward from the grid. So really make sure to thoughtfully consider what Z level each section of your UI is in, and make sure that the shadows it casts are appropriate, the movement is plausible, and in Polymer, in fact, you can use the paper shadow element to create Z depth and animate between Z of 1 to 5. So motion, as we talked about earlier, is also very important in material design, but it's also one of those things where it's really easy to go overboard with. So transitions and animations should be very deliberate and meaningful, but not necessarily gratuitous. A lot of the motion that you've seen in this presentation today required a non-trivial amount of work from motion designers specific to that role. So if you don't have dedicated motion designers, or you just don't have the time to finesse these things on your own, I would recommend just not worrying about it. It's better to stay simple than to spend a lot of time and effort making all these motions and animations that end up being more distracting than helpful. And also, you're going to get a lot of transition and animations for free from Polymer with the various UI widgets and elements. So if you do implement custom animations, we recommend that they be smooth, mimic true physical motion, give hints to your users about how this app works, and then also reflect users' choices and actions. All right, so now that we've covered the basics of material design, I really want to talk about some of the big changes that we've made in Chrome. So first, let me start by saying that applying material design to Chrome has been a very interesting design exercise for us. We really like to think of Chrome's core UI as a container for your guys' app and your guys' content, and we usually strive to be as invisible as possible. An approach that we've landed on is to begin to apply material design, starting first on mobile, using these core foundational elements that we talked about earlier. But on the core parts like tabs, the toolbar, and the Omnibox, we're still going to remain much more visually subtle than what an individual app might be doing. So we basically want our UI to be there for users when they need it, but most of the time they should be looking at your content, not Chrome. So beyond material design, some of the stuff that we've been doing is looking at how to make your apps fit more naturally and intuitively and beautifully into other platforms. So that brings me to some of the big changes that we've made in Chrome UX for Android L. First, the most visible change that you'll see here is that we've taken tabs outside of the Chrome app and put them at the same level as your recent apps in the overview. And so this is a pretty big change to the user experience of the browser, where we separately have a separate browser app that you go to. But we're really excited about this because it brings visibility of web content. It brings visibility to web content, and it actually unsilos the web from a browser app. And for users, we think that users shouldn't have to think about the technologies that apps are built on. If I'm planning a dinner with my friends and I'm looking at restaurant reviews on the web, I'm talking to my friends on my native messaging or email app, I'm going to be switching back and forth between those and planning this thing. I'm thinking about my task. I'm not thinking about oh, okay, that thing is on the web, so I need to go to the browser for that. That thing is native, so I need to go to this other switcher for that. So we want to have one single place to switch between tasks. And in addition to this new home for tabs, we want to continue to make steps to level the visuals between native apps and web apps. So you've noticed in material design in Android L that apps have really boldly colored toolbars. And starting in version 39 in Chrome for Android, you'll now be able to use a theme color meta tag to set Chrome's toolbar color, giving you more control over the look and feel of your content. The theme toolbars will be visible not only in the browser view, but in the recent overview section as well, to help users with recognizability. Of course, what you do here will really depend on the design of your content. You may not want to have multiple bars of really boldly colored things. So if you choose not to use a theme color, we're still going to be the same default gray that we are right now. So the syntax is pretty simple. You add a meta tag to your page's head with the name theme-color and set the content to any valid opaque CSS color. Chrome will also show high-res favicons in the overview, just like native apps have. And we pick the highest res icon that you provide, and we recommend providing a 192 by 192 PNG. All right, so all the details for that are on HTML5 Rocks and the Web Fundamentals site. So I hope I've helped you guys get a bit of a grasp on the efforts that we've been doing from a user experience front to move the mobile web forward. Material design is basically a framework that helps anyone really make thoughtful and well-designed apps, whether they're built natively or on the web, with a really small amount of effort using the tools and specs that we provide. And the changes in Chrome for Android Lollipop are our first steps to give you guys more control over the look and feel of your stuff and really simplify the workflow for our users who don't really care whether something is native or web. They just want to use the stuff that they care about. And even more importantly, what we need from you guys is to test out these changes in Chrome, the material design framework, and really, really stress test them with the complexity of your apps. Give us guidance and feedback, and that's the only way we're going to be able to move the mobile web user experience forward. Thanks.